All right. Thank you very much, Michael. And just want to appreciate and thank the whole team for inviting me to do today's event. It sounds like it's been a great success so far, and it's an honor to be here today. Um, I'm going to talk about procurement supply chain trends, but from a procurement perspective. So let me first of all just give a brief intro as to who I am and who Art of Procurement is. I'm Philip Ideson, as Michael said. I've been in this space for 25 years in the procurement and supply chain space. Started counting widgets in boxes for Vauxhall in the UK as a internship back in the late 90s. Parlayed that into a position with Ford Motor Company down in Bedfordshire. And then, from there on, I really got the procurement bug, and I've done a number of different things in procurement, up to including head of procurement and CPO level. And then I've moved on to the provider side, where I was doing a lot of delivering of procurement services and transformation, leading transformation programs. And then about 10 years ago, I thought, you know what, there's an education gap, I think, in procurement. In terms of really helping folks think about how procurement can truly change. And so I started Art of Procurement as a way to help close that gap. Today, we just have, podcasts, we do webinars, we have best practice guides, lots and lots and lots of content that helps procurement leaders, CPOs, and the folks that are working for them transform the impact of procurement. I'm based over in the States. I have been for 20 years. So now it's a hybrid Yorkshire and lots of different areas in the US accent that's going on over here. But it's a pleasure, as I say, to be here. So, agenda for today. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit just about the perspective of procurement. For those who aren't as familiar with the procurement side of supply chain, a little bit about what procurement is. Then we're going to go into three major trends. I'm sure you've heard some of these throughout the day today, but I'll go into it with a procurement perspective. There's some additional trends to watch if we get time, but I really want to make sure that we focus on some Q&A towards the end as well. Okay, so procurement versus supply chain. Procurement really, in most organizations, is a subset of supply chain. We're responsible for helping to translate a need of a business, and a need can be anything from I have an engineering drawing and I have a bill of material and I want to buy some components or some things that go into an end item to, I need to provide a space for childcare for parents of employees. How do I actually make that happen and use suppliers to make it happen? So anything really that the organization needs to buy, procurement in a number of organizations is involved in that, all the way from I have a need all the way through to we have bought what we want. Now we're looking to how we manage what we have bought to making sure that the suppliers have paid. And we're really accountable first and foremost, our success is measured in cost savings. Lots of debate about whether that's a right or wrong. It does differ a little bit industry by industry, but cost is at the forefront, and cost management and expense management is the forefront of what we do. But we're also measured on things like risk, quality, as you see there, sustainability, innovation. An organization spends a lot of their revenue on external suppliers. It can be anywhere from 15 to 25% of their revenue goes out the door to suppliers in non-manufacturing firms. Manufacturing firms, that can go up to 70% plus. So it's an important role that we play to help profitability of the business. So the first trend that I'll share with you today, and again, I'm sure you've heard a lot about this throughout the day. We can't obviously move with the volatility of geopolitics. If I take a little bit of a step back, this is not necessarily, obviously, the volatility that we're seeing over the past couple of months is new, but the trend of deglobalization is not necessarily new. It's been something that we've been following and tracking for a few years, really, probably since COVID. COVID being the first kind of big volatility moment that procurement professionals had to really deal with. In my opinion, just based on everything that I see and the CPOs that I talk to, it's a generational shift to deglobalize. Now that might be, it's not necessarily, things are made in China, so we're going to bring them all back to, here in the US, it would be bringing them back to the US or bringing them to Canada or bringing them to Mexico, whatever that might be. It's actually, how do we just reduce risk in the supply chain by going to, just not all of our supply chains based around one country or a small selection of countries. And there'll be a lot more kind of relationships between countries. Friendshoring is the term that's being used right now, to recognize that, well, actually, the US may have and the UK and Ireland may have friendly relationships with, let's say, India. And so there's going to be supply chains built in India as opposed to China. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be something next door, but there's a lot of it's rebuilding supply chains and capability in supply chains. And some of the things that we buy really isn't possible. In other things takes a long time. So definitely that's something that happens overnight. When it comes to kind of the trade policy shocks that we're seeing at the moment, the biggest challenge that the CPOs that I talk to is not necessarily even will tariffs happen or what those tariffs will be. And yes, that is impactful because it impacts us from the cost management side of procurement. It could influence us from a driving up inflation, which is obviously a big part of procurement's role in trying to mitigate the effects of inflation on the things that an organization buys. But more than anything, it's just the unknown. There's just so much whiplash, I think, that chief procurement officers are dealing with right now that I talk to in terms of where should we prepare, where should we run our scenario plans, what tariff is going to be where, how does that mean I change, where I'm buying for, or what mitigation plans can I put in place? And there's a lot of, I don't really know what to do at the moment. And so that's probably the volatility is as difficult for procurement to deal with as the actual, impact of the tariffs and things that we're seeing at the moment. What this means is that procurement is becoming a lot more of a risk management function. And so the cost savings that I talked about before, cost management is becoming a risk factor for an organization among many different risks, as opposed to it being cost savings alone. And that's something that I've seen evolve over the last few years. When was it probably 10 years ago, I traveled around the world delivering a risk management and third-party risk management training program. I've been involved in risk management a lot throughout my career in procurement. And so, as soon ago as 10 years ago, risk management was just seen as, it's a nice to have. It's not really that important, not something that procurement should really be that involved in, certainly not for businesses that don't have manufacturing. And when we're looking at risk factors for our supply chain, it's, what's their credit score? What's the company's credit score? And if it's a good score, I don't need to worry about risk anymore. Now, where we are here today, the challenge and the trend that is driving a lot of procurement actions is like, how do I go from being reactive to proactive? But beyond that, one of the things about risk is that it truly isn't possible to manage, mitigate, and monitor all risks at all times, because there's so many, black swan events. You can't really plan for a black swan event. So as important as proactive versus reactive monitoring is how do we stay agile? How do we help build supply chains that we can quickly move if we want to, which is, a big change from certainly most of my career in procurement supply chain, where you're locking in long-term deals, you're trying to use, put as much business with one or two suppliers as you can to get economies of scale, but all that kind of built in risk unknowingly, or, where we weren't really focused on risk, so we didn't really pay attention to it. So some of the things that procurement are doing related to the geopolitics is looking at who are the top suppliers, where are the biggest exposures, starting to do a lot more scenario planning than we ever did before, building in that agility to contract so that we have the ability to change much quicker than being stuck in a contract for 5 years. Supplier screening is a lot more important. Ultimately, who are the owners and where do they come from? And, are there any embargoes, for example, on taking investment from suppliers or being serviced and sending money to suppliers in certain regions? And there's a lot more, a bigger web of ownership structures for a lot of companies. So we got to kind of look and be more detailed in terms of onboarding suppliers. Of course, there is everything related to sustainability, which is for most CPOs something that's driven more by regulatory pressures and I would say it's kind of top down. Are they working for organizations that want to really focus on sustainability? Either because it's the right thing to do or because of regulatory requirements. Frankly, it's mostly because when I say the right thing to do, the financially the right thing to do for shareholders. We're still kind of at that point on sustainability. And as I said before, price considerations and how do you kind of balance the difference between if you want to be building a more agile supply chain, that's a more expensive supply chain, and your organizations you work for are not necessarily willing to pay that premium to have more flexibility. So that's something that procurement is really involved in from a discussion perspective in what is the right balance of agility versus cost. The second trend that I wanted to share with you today is the balance of power shift between buyers and suppliers. So certainly, in most of my time in procurement so far, the prevailing wisdom has been from most organizations has been, you know, the supplier gets my money and therefore I have the power in the relationship. And there's a lot of, what I would call traditional procurement is banging the fist on the desk, demanding things from suppliers. When things don't go so well, from an economic perspective, when you're struggling for, part of the business cycle where you're struggling as a business, oftentimes going out to suppliers, and I've seen this many, many times with blanket letters telling them they have to reduce their pricing, and really looking at this as a one-way relationship. And frankly, that's how I was brought up in my early years of procurement in the automotive industry. And actually, one of the motivators of setting up Art of Procurement was to try and get away and help share ways to get away from that, taking that perspective and those tactics and strategies. Now, what we're seeing now, and COVID was the great, leveler in this case, is that many times, the supplier has the power in the relationship. That's happened somewhat because we've created these monopolies or duopolies where companies go and select suppliers who are the biggest suppliers in their space or the biggest one or two suppliers in their space. They do that because they can get these economies of scale, but by doing that, we've created these super suppliers in multiple different places. There's other suppliers where there is only just one supplier. You don't really have a lot of leverage. And so what organizations and procurement teams have realized and are still realizing, because this is a trend that's kind of still in motion, is that we really need to look at how do we become a customer of choice, so that when there is a shortage, that our customers are thinking about us first and are allocating stock to us first. Or when there are price increases, they're working with us on how to mitigate those price increases rather than just pushing them straight through. In terms of communication, when there's risk events, working with us again first versus working with our competitors. So the way that you work with a supplier can really be a competitive advantage because you come to the front of the line. It's especially important as well when it comes to innovation, because really that's so much innovation comes from our supply base. I always kind of like to say that even for the biggest organizations with the biggest R&D budgets in the world, and I worked in pharmaceutical as well at one point, huge R&D budgets, it's still only a fraction of the R&D capability of your supply base. And so much collaboration can come from outside, and you want to be at the front of the queue to partner with your customers to do that. So ways that procurement are starting to shift their relationships with their suppliers, a lot more focus on supplier engagement and making sure that there's that kind of alignment at the executive level as opposed to just looking at everything you buy as a transaction. Looking at payment terms, making sure you pay on time. It's funny when organizations are setting up supplier relationship management programs, there's a lot of focus on relationships and strategy and synergy. I know it's kind of a buzzword, but all these kind of high level things that are more strategic in nature about how we can drive the relationship. Number one thing that companies can do is pay their suppliers on time. You'd be surprised, I'm not surprised if you're dealing with this firsthand, just how many organizations have a problem with doing that. Looking at how do you develop suppliers, I know that when I was in the manufacturing side in automotive, in cases where I had a monopoly or a duopoly in terms of the supply market for something I wanted to buy, so there really wasn't a lot of choice, we would invest time in going and training, developing product, and really getting in the weeds of companies who weren't yet our suppliers, so we could qualify them and get them up to a point where they could be a supplier, so we could introduce more competition to the market. But in doing that, you have built such a strong relationship with the supplier that you've developed that becomes a competitive advantage on its own. And then the other thing is being open and transparent, sharing where you're going, what your challenges are, you know, bumps in the road that you foresee, um, so that suppliers can help play a role in what your strategy is versus being very one way and just this is what we want to do, this is what we want from you. You tell me how you can do it. And again, very transactional relationship. The third trend that I wanted to cover today was less about it's less on on what we buy, and it's more about how we're buying, how we are managing all these problems. So it's kind of the tech-enabled future of procurement. This is a big trend because it really is calling into question how do organizations buy? How do organizations get access to the products and services that they need? What is the role of procurement? And so, there's not a day, there's not an hour, I think, that passes when we don't hear something about AI. As is the case in all other areas, of business, AI is um, it's on one hand an unknown. On the other hand, you can really see the opportunities that exist to drive both efficiencies in process through AI, but also doing things that have never been possible to be done before. We're obviously all really early in this journey, even though AI is not new in itself. And there's been a lot around, we've worked around RPA, process automation, for quite a few years that's been built into AI now. But really interesting future for all of us in procurement to figure out what that means and how we can be better. And, the kind of things that, you look at from a procurement perspective, from the simple, let's use Copilot or ChatGPT to help me write a scope of work to go into a request for proposal to go and solicit bids for something that I want to buy. That's time saving, all the way through to can technology do the negotiation for me? And there is a tool where technology can do negotiation and is doing negotiation through bots. For some of the world's largest companies like Walmart, Walmart are doing it to use bots. Walmart are using bots, for example, to negotiate payment terms across all of their suppliers. So really interesting things coming. There's interesting things around that predictive risk so that we don't need teams and teams and teams of people to do supply scenario planning to help us understand the effects of the volatility that we talked about at the beginning. A lot in the procurement space around workflow and process orchestration that's really interesting. So what that means is, helping an organization have a single place to go to buy what they want. Many organizations, that's extremely fragmented, and it's a really hard user experience, which is one of the things that causes in a lot of businesses a negative perception on the role of procurement. So these tools are now enabling, much simpler processes, more consumer-like processes for buying, which elevates the perception of procurement while giving procurement perhaps some invisible controls on the back end on how all those things are architected. Really, that's the goal for procurement is to increase that perception so that procurement professionals can work on those purchases that are the most strategic to the business, or solving challenges, taking advantage of opportunities that are truly strategic to the business, rather than running proposals for things that are bought that are not necessarily high impact purchases. And some examples of AI used in procurement technology. Really, I only put this slide in here because I wanted to give a shout out to a company called Keelvar. We don't work with Keelvar. We know who they are. We've worked with them in the past. There's no, I've not put them in here for any commercial reasons whatsoever, other than to say, they're based in Cork. Keelvar, I think it's probably for the last 10 years now, has really been a a leader in the procurement space in driving AI and procurement technology. Today, they have a lot of different things they do, including autonomous sourcing. But it's just great to see innovation coming from Ireland in the procurement space, and so I wanted to give a shout out to them. In the procurement space, there's been an explosion in technology. What's really happened over the last I would say 5 years or so is that a lot of venture capital firms would put investments in technology related to sales stacks and marketing stacks and HR and pure finance. And once those markets got saturated, there was probably a need for capital to go elsewhere, but there was also when COVID hit, this realization of the strategic impact of procurement and supply chain and the role that supply chain and procurement can play in a business, and a lot of money flowed into procurement and supply chain. So, we've gone from tracking 20 or 30 suppliers in procurement probably 5 years ago, 6 years ago, to there being hundreds now of providers. And it's a market that's still growing. It's a market that's kind of getting shaken out as obviously some companies thrive and some struggle to get traction, but it's a really, really, really interesting time in the procurement space. Couple of other trends that I'm sure that you've heard about throughout the day today that is on top of mind for procurement is sustainability and ESG. It's of course interesting to see how that's evolving due to the politics that we talked about at the beginning and how it's changing on a country by country basis. My perspective on sustainability is, as a Brit, I've often looked at the US as being a little slower on the uptake for sustainability initiatives. But at the end of the day, regulation is coming. There's obviously European regulation. There's regulation in California. If any business does business in any one of those locations, they're bound by those regulations. And so that's what's going to drive, focus on sustainability across the US and across, US-based and US headquartered companies. So I don't really see a let up in sustainability. On the social side of ESG, it's probably a little bit more country by country basis, a basis. So, for example, supply diversity has been a big focus the last few years in the States. Now it's not so much. That's not to say that the work around supply diversity isn't being done. It's just not being shouted about from the rooftops as it has been for the last few years. So it doesn't go away. It's different tactics, some slightly modified strategies, and definitely a lot different, communication around those initiatives. We're dealing with a talent and a skills gap in procurement. Having procurement leaders and professionals who kind of can make that evolution from the banging the fist on the table and leverage and around the buyer-supplier power to curious, data literate, understanding digital, a very different skill set. Honestly, the best CPOs that I talk to, the ones that stand out to me the most are the ones that say, I don't really know where we're heading. I may have a thesis, but I'm experimenting, I'm testing, I'm trying to find out, what hits and what doesn't hit, and what technology I can use and what didn't really work. But I'm in experimentation mode because we're on this journey kind of into the unknown. Those that are succeeding and those that definitely are proceeding with that in mind rather than kind of being stuck in the old way of doing things or just kind of being happy with the status quo. All right, I'm mindful of the time, so I do want to leave a couple of minutes for some questions. Just to recap on what CPOs are doing right now to respond to these trends. So as I said before, we're mapping all the critical supplies and the risks so we can figure out what's a plan for action in terms of managing and mitigating those, being a lot more agile in contracting, investing in pilots from tech, doing proof of concepts, just learning what's out there, experimenting, big part of a CPO role. At the moment, it's sometimes hard for CPOs because we're very much we've talked about risk today, but we're very risk averse historically in terms of building and changing our operating model. A lot of that is because procurement interplays with so many different parts of the organization that you do one thing wrong, it can have a really big multiplier effect across the rest of the business. But we're learning to be a little bit more, of a risk taker when we do some of these pilots. Definitely training is a big part of what CPOs are doing right now because we're operating in markets that a lot of procurement folks are not used to. and building those customer of choice programs. So it's been a whistle-stop tour through 3 trends that I see. Just a shout out for Art of Procurement. If you're interested in any content related to procurement and supply chain, we have over 1,000 podcasts, episodes. We have videos, we have white papers, lots and lots and lots of different content at artofprocurement.com that can probably touch anything that you're interested in, all free to access. So you're more than welcome to head there if you like. And with that, Michael, I'll come back to you for a couple of minutes at the end here.
Superb. Well, look, thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. I suppose just a question from me before we kick off, maybe in 1 or 2 other additional questions. I suppose as sustainability becomes non-negotiable,
Yeah.
I'm just wondering your thoughts on how can procurement ensure that supplier relationships are, I suppose, truly collaborative, especially when small or emerging suppliers may lack the resources to meet, I suppose, the evolving ESG expectations.
So it's a great question. I think that the answer depends on the size of your organization and how much you can invest in this. But the leading businesses that I see are helping to coach their suppliers to, make sure that they're, not just aligned with regulations, but doing the things in their business that they need to do to, to align with best practices around sustainability. A lot of businesses and the leading businesses on this topic see sustainability not as a what's the right word of saying it? Like, it's not specific to their organization. It's something that we have to solve as an industry. And as an industry, so the industry players will collaborate to, to help the customer base within their industry, for example, on sustainability issues. So I see that happening a lot as well. Ultimately, there will be a bit of a push and a pull. There will be, as companies write requests for proposals and solicit business from suppliers, there'll be requirements around sustainability. So companies will have to align with those requirements if they want to win business. But there's also this realization that there's a lot of businesses that need a helping hand, and so they shouldn't be discounted if they're the right supplier, as long as they're open to the coaching and the support and everything that they need to put it into practice. But that would really happen when it's mission critical purchases. It's not going to happen when you're buying something that feasibly could be bought from 10 other different companies without much of a problem.
Okay, thank you for that. A question here: how can AI-powered procurement tools support strategic sourcing decisions in a complex global environment influenced by foreign policy, geopolitical tensions, and shifting international relationships?
So that's probably a 30-minute conversation on its own, but it's a great question. I think that, right now, we look at probably the best use for AI in an environment like, kind of in a use case like that is gathering insights and information. So that more insights and information is available at the point of sourcing to help you make a decision on which is the most effective source to go with, taking into account all those different considerations, as opposed to just a price-based conversation, because that's often how, for better or worse, we're still, making decisions based on price versus total cost or all these different ramifications or risk factors. So it's there's not one tool that does that yet. We're on this journey, I think, where there's many different tools that started as non-AI companies and platforms that are starting to bring these capabilities in. This is where orchestration comes in. I talked about this area of procurement orchestration, which is kind of a platform. Think of it like your iPhone that connects with all these apps, which is all the software companies, to bring it into a single user experience. That's kind of where the market is heading in terms of being able to have a dashboard with all this information to help you make decisions. But the answer right now is probably there's a smorgasbord of different tools that can do individual pieces of that, but it's still on you as a buyer to figure out how to piece it all together.